Morning, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here, if slightly terrifying. And when I first agreed to speak about sport, I had visions of this sort of small community hall we were in last time, and not quite this. So I'm slightly terrified, but hopefully it'll be okay. As Lainey said, I've been involved in sport all my life, through my father, through my own participation, and through my children's participation in sport. Sport gave each of us more than the opportunity to compete. It gave us a sense of team spirit. It gave us opportunities that we would never otherwise have got. And particularly in my daughter's case, it gave her confidence that she really lacked before that. It gave her a sense of where she fitted into things, and she flew after that. Sport can also have a huge socio-economic impact, particularly on girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. That used to just be the case in America with college scholarships available, but more and more now with professional sport in the UK and with college scholarships widely open to UK athletes, this is having a huge impact on girls that may not have had opportunities otherwise. As Lainey said, I remain involved in Scottish athletics. I am on their records committee. It fits all my geekiness, a bit of stats and a bit of athletics, so my geekiness is there. But I'm also a gender-critical feminist. My friend laughs when I say that I got into the issue of gender ideology via sports, but I stayed for the lesbians. Well, why wouldn't you, really? But what I mean is that I became aware of gender ideology via sport, but I became active as a feminist when I saw lesbians being abused at Pride marches, and I could not believe what was happening. I could not believe that such blatant homophobia was happening in our streets. I had a chat with a friend in athletics when I was thinking about writing a talk for today. And the issues that are important to female athletes. And those include things like the impact of a menstrual cycle on competition and when the competition falls within a cycle. The prevalence of eating disorders in athletes, particularly distance runners. A number of them suffer from eating disorders, and the impact that has on bone density. Very famously, a superb young athlete, Bobby Clay, has had a battle with eating disorders. Sex abuse in the coaching setups of sport. I'd really like to be talking about those issues today, but instead I'll be focusing on the biggest issue that's facing women and girls in sport, and that's the inclusion of male-born athletes in female sporting categories. So, how did we get to the point where there are numerous now male-born athletes competing in women's sport? Well, from a personal perspective, I think the Translobby have been relatively clever in this area. Because a few years ago, there was an excellent, I think maybe about 10 years ago, I think my son was about 16, there was an excellent Rainbow Laces campaign. And it was there to tackle homophobia in sport and to ensure that sport was inclusive of anybody, you know, of whatever their sexual orientation. And it was very successful. But gay athletes compete in the appropriate sporting categories. But if you listen to the Translobby's arguments now, it's always framed in terms of inclusivity. I just want to play the sport I love. And I think that's one of the reasons it's been difficult for sporting bodies to push back against this. But identities don't play sports. Bodies play sport. And sport is not segregated to recognise women's feminine qualities, but to ensure fairness and safety of female competitors. There are more than 6,000 differences between a male and a female body. They include average height differences, longer limbs, narrower hips, a different pelvic tilt, which helps to have a longer stride, bigger hands and feet, which aid ball handling and swimming, larger lungs and hearts, which aid oxygen transfer around the body, different muscle mass, more fast twitch fibres, which help in explosive sports like sprinting and football. They also help with jumping. None of these are significantly impacted by the suppression of testosterone. The only current scientific peer-reviewed study on the impact of testosterone, it was a Swedish study, concluded that suppressing testosterone for a year had only a minimal impact on muscle mass. Even at current limits, a trans woman has a testosterone level many times that of a natal female. During 2021, the author of that report, Tommy Lundberg, and Dr. Emma Hilton, a developmental biologist who almost all of you will know tweets under the handle @FondofBeatles, completed a report looking at the male advantage over females in sport and concluded that those ranged from around 10 to 13% in sports like rowing, swimming, and track athletics, 29 to 34% in activities such as golf drives and cricket bowling, and over 50% in things like baseball pitching and hockey drag flicks. What that means in real life is that a male will run 100 metres around a second faster than a female. But what that means in track terms is they'll be around 18 metres ahead at the end of the race, allowing for a slow start. A male golfer will on average drive a ball 55 metres further than a female golfer, and so on. In 2021, the fastest time that a woman ran the 100 metres was 10.54 seconds. Now that's pretty damn quick. It's close to the world record, Flojo's world record, but in 2021, more than 1,000 men ran faster than that. In athletics, the average age at which a male will exceed the female world record is 14. And each year, thousands of men exceed the best performances in the world set by women. So the issue we're actually faced with is not actually one of inclusion. Everybody can participate in sport. The issue is how and why we segregate sport into different categories, and we have to get governing bodies to focus back on that. Sport is segregated to address physical differences, where those differences confer an unfair advantage. Now, there's some sports that aren't segregated at all. Equestrianism isn't segregated because it's felt that any advantage is not seen as significant. Some sports are just segregated by sex: athletics, swimming, football, and rugby. These seek to address the more than 6,000 differences between female and male physiology. And some sports are segregated by sex and weight to ensure skill is recognised and athletes can compete fairly and safely. A heavyweight boxer competing with a flyweight would not only have a significant physical advantage, but would also pose a threat of serious injury to the flyweight. An argument that's often brought up when this issue is discussed is that what I call the tall woman argument, and the fact that sports are not segregated for height, which may confer a slight advantage in some sports. The simple answer to this is that whilst there may be a slight advantage of being taller, it's not always the case, because other females may have faster twitch fibres or other advantages which balance it out. But when you have a tall male competing against women, they will have all the other advantages of being a male: the muscle mass, the heart, the lungs. And so it's that combination of advantages is why we segregate sport. Interestingly, when you look at this sort of tall athlete argument, there's two American swimmers, Ryan Lochte and Missy Franklin. Both of them are around the same height. They're about 6'1". Both of them have the same arm span, roundabout. They're both world record holders in their class, and both have competed in the same event in the male and female categories. Ryan Lochtey's best times are 10 seconds faster than Missy Franklin's, and Missy Franklin, who is one of the best swimmers the world has ever seen, would never make the final in an open competition. Participation by transgender males is increasing. Males are taking female national high school titles in the US. They're denying girls scholarships. Cece Telfer took the NCAA hurdles title, having previously sat at 390th in the male rankings. And I doubt there's any of us that haven't been watching as Leah Thomas rips up the swimming world record, swimming college records, despite competing as Will Thomas until 2 years ago, and ranking 472nd in the male categories. But more of Leah later. Another factor that we also can't discount is abuse by individuals or rogue nations. I've been told that this is paranoia and just something that I've made up. But those of us that were involved in sport in the 1970s or 80s, or even just watching sport in these decades, will be aware of doping, either state-sponsored or by individuals. Times posted by athletes like Marita Koch, Kratochvilova, Volova, Florence Griffiths-Joyner remain unattainable for athletes today. Are we really naive enough to think that some nation will not persuade an athlete, perhaps just below Olympic level, to take testosterone suppressants for a year and make a farce of women's sports altogether? It will happen. In talking about testosterone, it's also worth remembering that the use of artificial testosterone by female athletes is prohibited, and any female athlete caught doping can expect a substantive punitive ban. Why then should a trans woman athlete who has benefited from testosterone for years be allowed to compete? We're told there is limited evidence and only a small study showing the impact of testosterone suppression and that we must wait. But there is actually a huge body of evidence on the impact of testosterone on athletics performance, and it's available from the 1970s and 1980s. There was widespread state doping at that time, and if the only difference between a male and female athlete is their level of testosterone, then why during that widespread doping era did no female ever get close to male elite performance? Sporting bodies never look at that issue. The other major issue that needs to be discussed when the inclusion of trans women in female sport is safety, particularly in the area of contact sport. Now, athletics and swimming are relatively safe. There isn't any contact in these sports. But in its review of the inclusion of trans women in female rugby, World Rugby concluded that there was an increased risk of around 30% of serious injury, and they found that that was unacceptable. Now, those who follow UK rugby may be aware of the case of Kelly Morgan, a trans-identified male who played in, or was training certainly with a Welsh women's rugby team. Kelly, who in training broke the coach's ankle and knocked fellow players down like deck chairs. But I'll come back to rugby developments later. What I would ask each governing body is how will they explain to the parents or loved ones of a seriously injured female player that a male's feelings were more important than their daughter's safety? There are other issues that go along with the inclusion of trans women in female sports. Athletes need to change and shower, and those showers and changing rooms are often communal. And that can be a significant problem for female players. Hannah Mounsey, a trans-identified male who competed on the Australian handball team, was selected to play for the Australian women's handball team in an international competition. But things came to a head when changing facilities were discussed. The girls on the team did not want to shower with Mounsey, who retained his penis, and Handball Australia arranged a separate changing facility to protect Mounsey's privacy and dignity. Mounsey was having none of it. He issued an ultimatum, and he either changed and showered with the others, or he wasn't going. Now, fair play to Handball Australia, they stood their ground, and Mounsey walked. Often it's difficult and frustrating to try and challenge this. Recent reports from British Cycling suggest that athletes may be fined or have their licences removed if they dare challenge the inclusion of trans-identified males in the sport. There are also recent reports of men playing in Scottish women's football, and the Scottish Women's Football Association are now having to update their transgender policies following a discovery that no monitoring of the regulations with reference to testosterone levels has been done by clubs or the association. The question I've been asked most often is by athletes and parents is what can I do about this? I know it can seem daunting, but the more people that speak out, the less governing bodies can ignore these issues. The review of football policy came from player pressure. Sports governing bodies tend to be dominated by men who either don't really care about women's sport or who won't tackle the issue for fear of being branded as transphobic. But the more people are speaking out, it does have an impact. Talked about rugby before. Now, when the World Rugby policy or review came out, England Rugby said they weren't going to adhere to that, and it was wrong and it wasn't inclusive. But since then, they've actually set transgender guidelines that mean very few, if any, trans-identified males will be able to play in England Rugby anymore. They set height levels at 5'7" for trans-identified males and a weight limit of 90 kilograms. There are very few trans-identified athletes that will fit that mould. And also, even if they pass that, the player needs to go through a safety impact assessment. It's a cowardly approach, and it's not enough, but it's a movement. So the first thing I would do if you're involved in sport is get informed. Go to the Fair Play for Women website, where there's lots of useful information and resources. Look at what the guidelines are for your sport. Respond to any consultation. Do the research. Read Tommy and Emma's report. Anything else you can find. And what safety reports have been commissioned? Ask what they cover. Ask to see them. The IOC has been pretty unhelpful in this, in passing the decision about inclusion back to individual sports. But the sports councils of the home nations recently made a joint statement which concluded that you can either have inclusion or you can have fairness, but you can't have both. They've stopped short of banning trans-identified males competing in women's sport, but Scottish Rugby is currently reviewing its policies as a result. So although sport is run by governing bodies and not governments, lobby your MSP. Get a friendly one. It might be a Tory, but there you are. To ask the questions and put pressure on national governing bodies. Look, I hope that Leah Thomas will be a watershed moment. Leah as well was a mediocre college swimmer. As Leah, he is an Olympic standard swimmer and has stated his intent of competing in 2024. Athletes don't like it, parents don't like it, and fans don't like it. If you haven't heard it already, I would really urge you to go and listen to the Women's Declaration International podcast that was on this week with the mother of an Ivy League swimmer who has had to swim against Leah. The messages that are being sent to these girls are not just about competition. They are about how women should behave. Sit down, keep quiet, ignore your boundaries, and always prioritise men. I was in tears as I listened to it. A senior official in US swimming resigned over the issue, and more ex-sports stars are speaking up. More people are becoming emboldened to speak up the more the issue is discussed. The Leah Thomas issue has already had an impact in US swimming. They've changed their guidelines. Instead of 1 year of testosterone suppressant, it's 3 years. And even if they pass that, a 3-person medical panel will decide if the athlete has benefited from male testosterone as they develop. It's not enough, again. It's not a total ban, but it's a movement. And the more we move, the more we get closer to where we want to be. There's also action elsewhere. Denmark's Olympic Committee has announced its findings that the advantage held by trans women athletes is such that they should never compete in the elite female category. Again, it's not enough. It's elite sport. And how do you become an elite athlete? You compete at junior level. But it's a start, and I'm hoping that others will follow suit. Look, I've contributed to consultations in numerous sports. I'm not an expert in a lot of them. I know an awful lot about athletics, but I'm not an expert on other sports. But a lot of the questions are generic ones that you can answer if you've sort of armed yourself with the facts on it. I still believe that sport will be one of the first areas where women's rights will be upheld. The more of us that speak up, the more sports will be unable to ignore the issue and the evidence. That's all I've got. Listen, thanks for listening. Thanks everyone for coming here, and thanks so much to Forth Valley Feminists for hosting it.